Welcome, advocates, to another episode of the Lead in Equity podcast, a podcast that focuses on supporting educators with the tools and resources necessary to ensure equity at their schools. Today's special guest is Dr. Susan Sturm. So without further ado, Susan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Such a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure's always mine. I'm excited to talk about today's topic. This is like right on par with my show and what it's all about and why I created this show, because of advocacy. And I started this show because so many folks were reaching out to me and saying, look, I need help with maybe some of the language on how to address some things, what to say, how to approach. I see something needs to change. I don't know how to go about it. And you have a new book, but we're going to get all into that, and we're going to get into the topic. I don't want to get ahead of myself. So let's start off with, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you currently do.
Well, thanks for asking. I am currently a professor at Columbia Law School, and I'm also the director of the Center for Institutional and Social Change. And I have the privilege in that role of writing about issues of race and equity and what I call full participation, which is building environments and institutions where people of every race, gender, background can access, succeed, thrive, and contribute to the thriving of others. So I write about that. I've just published a book called What Might Be: Confronting Racism to Transform Our Institutions. And I teach about that. I teach courses called like Lawyering for Change, The Theater of Change, Reimagining Justice, Lawyer Leadership, Leading Self, Leading Others, Leading Change, Access to Justice for People in Prison. And I also have the privilege of working with organizations that are trying to advance full participation and want to get some help, want to get some help in doing that in a way that will build the capacity for everyone in that organization to participate in pushing forward with that change process.
Nice. Well, again, I'm happy to have you on the show. So it's an honor, and I'm excited. So let's get into it, because as I mentioned earlier, I got excited. So I kind of went off for a second. But as I mentioned earlier, advocacy work is a big piece to this show. And you notice I said welcome advocates. And that's what I've been saying for the last 5 years. And so this is very important. I have folks that want to become change agents. Some of them are brand new teachers. Some of them are paraprofessionals. Some of them are counselors. Some of them are just various capacities within our school systems, and they need help. They ask me all the time, what can I say? What do I do? And how do I approach it? And so I want to start off with, what are some strategies or maybe some thoughts behind becoming a change agent, but not doing all of the work? Because I will say, your school leader are your chief diversity, equity, inclusion specialists, advocates in general. So I don't want to take off the weight from them, but how can we become those change agents?
Well, this is music to my ears, because this is the very reason that I wrote this book.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot out there about what not to do. There's a lot out there about documenting the way racism is and sexism is operating in our institutions. And that's very important work. But there isn't as much out there that really helps people, everyday people who are working in organizations, to say, well, how do I become more effective as a change agent? And that was really the thinking behind this book, because I have had the opportunity to work with people who really have gotten stuck. I call it like stuck in Groundhog Day.
Okay.
They've tried the same thing
Yes.
over and over and over again. And part of what happens is, if you don't recognize that trying to address race and racism really puts you at the intersection of a paradox, a set of paradoxes, these contradictions that cannot be avoided, and that you have to learn how to hold those contradictions rather than try to do just one side or the other. So, for example, I'm a white woman. Should I even be writing a book about racism? That's putting me right in the center of the paradox of racialized power. If I step up and push out the people who have had direct experience dealing with racism, I'm going to really defeat my goal. But if I don't step up as a person who's setting up environments for so many people and create the space for those people of color to be part of that process, that also will lead us to being stuck. And so there are these paradoxes: the paradox of racialized power. There's the paradox of racial salience. Should I be talking about race? If I don't talk about race, how will people of color trust me? If I don't talk about race, how will we be able to address race? But if I talk about race, or I only talk about race and racism, I might push out people who need to be part of the conversation because they don't think about things in terms of race and racism. I might also overlook other categories of exclusion that are very important, such as gender, religion, or class. And I might, if I only talk about race, I might always be confronting the government that is at this particular moment trying to shut us down from talking about race. So we're experiencing that
Yes.
paradox even more intensely than we ever have, but it's always been there. So that's that paradox of racial salience. And then there's the paradox of, well, can I even work in institutions that are predominantly white institutions that are supposed to be engines of mobility and of equity, but are so often working in exactly the opposite direction? We have to both work with institutions and work to transform them. So inside, outside, another paradox. And so one of the things that's really important is to first recognize that there's no way to avoid these contradictions if you're really serious about addressing issues of race and equity, and that you have to learn how to treat them as opportunities for reflection, for learning, for connection with people who see the world different than we do, and then for figuring out what's causing them, what's leading us to be in this place, and how can we do both? Because we need to do both. We need to talk about race, and we also need to talk about broader categories of inclusion, of what I call full participation, so that we get everyone at the table without letting go of this critical focus on race and racism. So that's one strategy, is just to know we're in it. And I've seen leaders and students, it's almost like breathing a sigh of relief. You mean I don't have to pick one or the other? You mean that I can be in this even if I can't resolve it? And the answer is yes. And then the question is, what do you do? Well, everyday people can build collaborations that cut across race and class and occupational position, that work on projects that identify what I call linked fate. Linked fate is the idea first developed to think about why Black people tend to vote as a block, why they tend to vote, even though they're very different, even they come from different parts of the country. They're different by social class, they're different by background, but they tend to see their interests as aligned, so that what affects one affects all. And that idea of linked fate, I think we need to be thinking and working really hard to identify the linked fate that cuts across race, across class, across different positions and identities, because that's how you build long-term sustainable collaborations. And so right now, I think there's a lot of linked fate around just preserving our democratic institutions and fighting for them. That is something that, even if we might disagree about some very important issues, I think many people who might see themselves on opposite sides of any specific issue see themselves coming together around needing to really fight for the continued rule of law, for the continuance of genuine participation in our governing our schools. So these could become projects. Well, how do you do that? Well, you can build Adrienne Marie Brown's term of fractals. I don't know if any of your readers have ever come across Adrienne Marie Brown's book called Emergent Strategy. And it's a book that's written for everyday people with stories. And it's a beautiful book written for change agents. And she talks about fractals. And fractals, I call them microspaces of justice. These are small versions of the big world that we want to see. But we got to start right now. So we build something, and it can start with a reading group. It can start with a project aimed at supporting people in figuring out, how do we talk about race in our classrooms? It could be figuring out some kind of project to build the capacity to have difficult conversations. These are all little things that people can come together around, and you build these spaces to have the values and the practices that you would like to see in the larger institution. And then you connect these fractals. So fractal gives rise to fractal, gives rise to fractal. And then you can go to your leaders and say, look at what we're doing. You need to support this. And you need to support what I call organizational catalysts. These are the people, and I would venture to say that you are one, who bring people together across difference and find ways to help them identify linked fate, and then help build environments that are joyfully struggling with these kinds of challenges and can stick with it over the long haul. And these are things that people who don't have any formal position of power can do. And by the way, anyone who's a teacher is already a leader.
Yeah.
Anyone who is a teacher is already a leader. They're a leader of their classroom, they're a leader of their department, they're a leader of their field, and they're often leaders in the community. So even if you're not leading the whole institution, the whole school, you have a space where you can really create environments where, if you can then find ways to connect with each other, you can create kind of an engine of transformation starting from the bottom up.
Listen, you started off with a bang, and there's so much that I want to unpack there, because I love how you start off with the paradox side of things. Like, you mentioned a lot of things, such as, like, maybe I'm a white person and who am I to speak about race, right? Because I don't have the lived experiences. But if I don't say anything, then so, like, you went in a lot of different directions. But I love the way you set it up, because initially I was thinking, oh man, this sounds overwhelming. To, like, as a Black person, I feel overwhelmed sometimes when it comes to these conversations, let alone someone who's white, maybe feel it like. So there's all these different dynamics there, and I love how you started there. But I heard you mention something a couple times, and I want to go into that a little further, because you talked about full participation.
Yeah.
I want to hear the definition of what full participation is, because I remember there was a term: performative wokeness, performative justice, performative this, performative that. Was really, we still hear that a lot in a lot of our languages as well these days. So is there a relation, or is it something totally different? I'm just kind of curious as far as
Yeah.
full participation.
So I agree with you that there's a substantial amount of work that would be located under the umbrella of diversity, equity, and
Yeah.
inclusion that has been check the box, do a implicit bias training and make everybody go, even if it gets them mad. And then you've done what you need to do and you can just move on. And so in that sense, we need to use this time as an occasion to say, what are the values and the aims that we're really trying to achieve here? And that's why, I mean, I don't think full participation is necessarily the one language we should use. I don't think we should get hung up on any specific language. It's the practices. But full participation is one of those terms that really can bring together people to actually engage in a long-term set of practices. So first of all, full participation is about a setting, about an organization, about a department. It's about a space that people are in, and that's a space that has to achieve a way of involving everybody who should have access to that space. So full participation means that people of every race, gender, class, background, identity, position can access that space, can thrive in that space, can succeed in that space, can contribute and have their voice heard in that space. And very importantly, I have seen that genuine full participation happens when someone is so much a part of that space that they are in a position to contribute to the thriving of others. That a big part of being human is wanting to have an impact on others. So full participation in its fullest sense is an environment that enables all of those things for people, whatever their identity, race, gender, etc. And this is a long-term process. It doesn't happen overnight in a society that is as unequal and stratified and exclusionary as our society is.
Can you give me an example of a space, the space that you're referring to?
Sure. I can give you a small example of the fractal, and I can also give you an example of an organization that came as close to achieving full participation as I have seen. And this is not the norm. So the small example is the Theater of Change, which is a program that I collaborate in with an organization called the Broadway Advocacy Coalition. And this is an organization that's committed to rewriting the narrative about race, racism, and mass incarceration, with people directly affected by racism and incarceration at the center of that process. So what do? We bring in three groups: law students, performing artists, and advocates directly affected by incarceration who are involved in some kind of advocacy project. We then set up a space where everyone's equal, all kinds of knowledge are equal, and we create a space where people learn about each other, where they learn how to communicate across these disciplinary lines. And we're talking about artists, talking to lawyers, talking to advocates. These are people who may have never talked to someone like this before, but who recognize that they need each other. Their fates are linked. They can't achieve what they want to achieve without each other. And then, very importantly, they go through a process where they have a shared goal, a product, which is a performance piece that will also be used to advocate for change, and that all of these groups contribute in. And so we set up a set of ground rules, and we hold each other accountable in that space. And this is really important. It's very common to set up ground rules. Then you move forward as if they never exist. But this is a space where we really think hard about how to practice at every step of the way, holding each other to account in ways that bring people in rather than push them out if they make a mistake. And then using that as a way to build something that will enable people with influence to understand why change is important and to become part of that change process. That is a microspace of justice.
Okay.
That's the microspace. And every teacher has the power to do that in their classroom. I learned that from Lonnie Guinier, my dear friend and collaborator who passed away before her time, that every teacher can create a space that has at its root full participation through creative experimentation, through sharing power, and through critical engagement. Now, how do you do this at the level of a whole organization? I will say, to be completely transparent and also have integrity, it's very difficult, and it doesn't happen that often with predominantly white institutions, but I have seen it happen. And the example that I bring to mind is the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. The University of Maryland, Baltimore County was, about 30 years ago, a predominantly white, kind of mediocre, local public college, university that no one was proud of. And that also the people of color who were part of the institution, the Black and brown students, felt that they were experiencing racism. And they were also not succeeding in the science, technology, engineering, and math fields, the STEM fields. Freeman Hrabowski came to UMBC as a provost, and he was confronted with protests of Black students who occupied his office at the very first week he got there. And instead of responding defensively, he responded by saying, "What's going on here? Let me understand this." But he didn't only want to understand what was wrong with these Black students, which is often the response when you have a group that's complaining, particularly if they're not white, and when you have a group that is not succeeding in current terms. What's wrong with them? No, he said, what's wrong with us? What are we doing that's failing these students? And he did a very systematic inquiry that wasn't only about the students of color, but was looking at how is science being taught. And he learned that the teaching of science, technology, engineering, and math was failing everybody, not just the Black students. The Black students were what my dear colleague Lonnie Guinier would call the miner's canary, that they were the ones who are signaling the toxicity of the entire environment of teaching of science. And so Freeman Hrabowski created a fractal, the Meyerhoff program, which started out focusing on Black boys and girls, to say, how do we create an environment that will enable them to succeed and thrive in the STEM fields? And built into that program these conditions, strong mentorship, financial support, having very engaging classrooms, and also working with teachers to say, you need to rethink the way that you're teaching, not only these students, but all the students, because they are bored and you're teaching so they fail instead of so that they succeed. And then over time, he was actually required to open up the programs to everybody by the law. So instead of abandoning them, he maintained a focus on making sure that everyone, including students of color, could succeed. But he took these same strategies and he applied them in many other spaces, to women in STEM, to student government, to people who were incarcerated, who lived in the surrounding community. And eventually, this way of working that started in this fractal became part of the culture of UMBC. And he did this by seeding, meaning creating seeds of leadership at every level and in every position within UMBC. So there were students and faculty and staff and community members who were all part of this process of building these fractals where people would be pushing towards inclusive excellence. And this became a culture. And one of the things that happened as a result of this is at UMBC, if you saw a Black kid in a science class, you were likely to think that they were most likely to be at the top of the class, because that's what the experience was after several rounds of this process. So this is an example. One of the things that's very important, Freeman Hrabowski was the president of UMBC for more than 25 years. This was not, let me do this in 1 year or 2 years. He made a long-term commitment, and that's how it happened. And that's why people who are everyday leaders are so important. They're often in this for the long haul. And this kind of longer term culture change toward full participation requires really a lifetime commitment. I mean, we've been unequal for how many centuries? We're not going to become fully participatory overnight.
I love how, first of all, thank you for sharing both of these examples. It's sad to hear that there's only, as you mentioned, that only a few institutions, predominantly white institutions, have achieved this. So one part of my response is I want to know why. Why is that the case? And then the other part was you mentioned on a smaller scale when you brought the different groups together, you had law students, you had those who were incarcerated, and you talked about the ground rules, how that worked out. So I want to touch on those two pieces, but let's start with, because at the end of the day, ground rules will probably be relevant to both scenarios. So
Yes.
how do we, because I'm thinking you got law students, you got students that are folks that are incarcerated, you have maybe professors, things like that. How do we make sure that no one feels like they're better than the other? There's no hierarchy, everyone's on the same level? Because I heard you stress that. So what are some of that, what does that ground rules look like?
Well, so some of these are, I would predict, very well known to the listeners, that speak in the first person,
Yeah.
show respect for each other, call people in rather than calling people out, think hard about what we talk about listening and how hard it is to listen on these, especially on levels, what we call the level 2 and 3, focused listening. So you're listening not because you're saying about what the person is saying, but you're listening, how can I really understand what this person means and what's important to them? And how do I listen on a global level? Listen with an understanding of the system that this situation or this person is part of. We do a lot of ground rules around listening and how you really listen. And then we also talk about the importance of speaking up and having the hard conversation, but in a way that assumes that people want to improve, that they want to connect. So that's very important. And we also set it up so that no one has the corner on knowledge. We really talk a lot about how expertise is a much broader concept than the way we really think about it, so that law students know certain things, but they don't know about the way systems actually work. They only know the way law is on the books,
Yeah.
but it's the people who have experienced it that know the way the legal systems are actually working and where they're failing and what people need. So that's another really important ground rule, is that people really listen and learn to value other people's expertise and to understand what it is that they don't know. And then we also talk about that people need to think through, when am I, there's want and wait. Why am I talking? Why am I not talking? So people really kind of calibrating their participation with an eye toward making sure that everyone gets to fully participate. And we also really do a lot to train the facilitators to be able to hold these kinds of conversations. So I would say this is something where, if teachers and professors, at least law professors, are often very afraid of these kinds of conversations and avoid them because they don't feel that they can actually handle a hard conversation that involves race or racism. So we also talk a lot about capacity building and really taking the time to learn how to raise these issues in ways that make you part of solving them, rather than you've got to have all of the answers as the facilitator in front of the room.
All right. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, I was curious about that because you got all these different folks in, and how do we make sure that the goal still remains the same? I'm assuming there was some, like, you still got to check in every now and then to make sure, hey, folks, let's remember our ground rules. So that's good to hear.
Something about that is too, we introduce the ground rules on the very first day, but we actually don't talk about them in any depth until the second or third day, where we say, what have you noticed about what's working, what's not working? And then we ask the group to come up with ways to actually make sure that the group is abiding by the ground rules. And the hardest part is when you have someone who has a lot to contribute but is talking a lot and doesn't recognize that they're taking up a lot of space and making it really difficult for other people to be heard. And the opposite problem, white people who say, I don't want to take the risk of speaking. I don't know anything about race. I'm just going to listen. And a lot of people have not had the opportunity to hear, as I have, when I have made that, that is not a way to build responsibility, to step out of speaking about your own experience with race and racism, and that this is something we have to learn how to do, and that it's very important that everyone contribute, and contribute in a way that it attends to what we each bring to the table, and also what we each do not bring to the table.
Oh, man, I love this. Okay. So the other part that I wanted to touch on, you mentioned predominantly white institutions, the success rate, if you will, in regards to the change that's out there. You gave us a really good example as far as a 25-year stint that took that long. So is that maybe the reason why things isn't as successful, or are there other contributing factors? I mean, what are your thoughts?
Well, one reason why this is hard to come by is that our measures of success tend to be very short term. And so if you don't produce miraculously results that are measured numerically in terms of outcomes within a very short period of time, whether it's foundations or trustees or whoever will say, oh, this is a failure, and move on, rather than having measures of success that really track what you can accomplish in a short period of time. And a lot of that has to do with building the commitment and participation of people in actually doing the work. That needs to be more of what we're measuring. Are we increasing the number of people who are actively engaged and stay engaged over a longer period of time? And also tracking improvement rather than only tracking outcomes of where we want to get over a longer period of time. So one problem is if we impose measures of success that are unrealistic and that discourage people from sticking with things for the long run. But there are other structural features that get in the way, and that I call being stuck in Groundhog Day in the book. What are those other structures? Well, first of all, there's a narrative. It's a scripted stuckness that we assume the way things are or the way it has to be. and that it's always going to be like that. We see this with, for example, judges who come into a courthouse and are very accustomed to seeing mostly white judges and mostly people of color who are in conditions in the courthouse that we would never accept for our family members or for people that we care about, but that's just the way it is. And so this scripted stuckness, you just learn to do things and to accept the way things are rather than stepping back. And then there is this, what I call role rigidity, which is, I'm just a teacher. What do I have to say about the larger institution? I'm just supposed to teach my subject. I'm not supposed to be asking questions about, it's not my job to ask questions about what people are experiencing when they're not actually in my classroom, whether it's my students or their families or whether it's the school itself. And we see this role rigidity happening all over the place where it's nobody's job to take care of this. And therefore, nobody does except for the person at the top of the institution who's getting lots of pressures not to do that and who might not last past the first 4 years. So that's a real problem, is this role rigidity. And then finally, there's this tendency towards system justification, that people in power, it's really hard to face up to the fact that you're in an institution that is treating people badly, or that's unjust, or that with our best efforts or not such good efforts are continuing to reproduce racial inequality and lack of mobility, or an unjust justice system. And so people don't like to face up to that. And they don't like to do that, whether they're the ones benefiting from it, or surprisingly, even if you're the ones who are hurt by that system. You'd like to find a way to justify it so that it's easier psychologically to accept the status quo. And so there are all of these factors that are producing these paradoxes that make it likely, unless we really make a very concerted effort, but in a way that is doable, to change this. And so one of the things I like to do myself that has been helpful for people that I've worked with is to think about zooming in and zooming out. I've just zoomed out, and I just zoomed out to all of the factors that make it hard for predominantly white institutions to really move to a place of full participation. And if we focus only on that, we're going to get really discouraged because that's overwhelming. We can't change all of that, but it's important that we know that it's going on, because that will help us decide, where do we focus our efforts? Where do we zoom in? So once we pick that place where we think we can get some leverage, and where we have a group of multiracial change agents who are willing to come together and do some work, we can zoom in to that space, that microspace of justice, and just work there where we actually can do something about the space we're in, about the environment. We can energize each other. We can decide that we can have the courage to speak up, not just individually, but collectively. We can create the change agents of the future in our students, who are going to have to deal with this for a lot longer than those of us who are in front of the classroom. And we can have the joyful struggle of seeing something actually happen in those micro spaces of justice. But then we got to zoom back out again. We got to zoom back out and say, who else is doing this that I need to connect to so that I can have impact beyond my micro space, because it's very fragile, that space, and I want to have bigger impact. And how am I falling short? How do I need to push our leaders? How do I need to get involved in the larger political system in a way that I never have before? Because I realize now we can't leave this to people who don't care about us. Then we zoom back in again when we get overwhelmed. So that zooming in and out is a strategy for dealing with all of these factors that keep us stuck without getting overwhelmed or giving up.
Woo! Susan, let me tell you something right now. You just brought the fire today, and I have learned so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Bringing the heat. So, all right. Let's wrap this up. This, like I said, I've learned a lot, folks. Links in the show notes. Make sure you grab the book. Susan, I'd love for you to take us home with any final words of advice you want to provide to our listeners.
Yes, there's this phenomenon called internal emigration, where when you're feeling attacked by the larger government, you just retreat to your own kitchen table and you hide under the covers. And I want to say that this is a time where we have to resist internal emigration, and everyone needs to be a change agent, and everyone needs to create an environment where we're connecting to people we've never connected to before, and we're taking action we've never taken before, because our democracy and our future generations are really at stake. And I encourage you, if you want to hear more, feel free to reach out to me, and also to read my book, What Might Be: Confronting Racism to Transform Our Institutions.
Thank you. If we have some folks that want to reach out, what's the best way to connect online?
The best way would be, there is a website called whatmightbe.me, and you can also email me at sturm@law.columbia.edu.
There it is. All right. Well, once again, here with Dr. Susan Sturm. Thank you so much for your time. It has truly been a pleasure.
Thank you.